The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as photographer James Mitchell adjusted his camera lens for what he hoped would be the shot of his career. It was 1987, and the royal family was gathering for an official portrait to commemorate Queen Elizabeth II's upcoming birthday celebrations. James had been hired by the Palace Press Office after years of building his reputation, photographing celebrities and politicians, but this was different. This was the royal family. James had arrived early, his assistant helping him set up the elaborate lighting equipment in the blue drawing room. The ornate space, with its gilded furniture and priceless artwork, provided the perfect backdrop for what the palace had described as an informal family portrait. He checked his equipment one final time, ensuring every detail was perfect. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the chairs and adjusted the lighting stands. The Queen arrived first, punctual as always, wearing a powder blue dress that complemented the room's decor. She greeted James with a warm smile and took her position in the center chair with the practiced ease of someone who had posed for thousands of photographs. Princess and followed, then Prince Andrew and Prince Edward, each taking their designated spots according to the palace protocol that had been explained to James in painstaking detail the day before. Prince Charles entered the room with Diana, who looked stunning in a navy blue outfit that made her sapphire engagement ring sparkle under the studio lights. The young princes, William and Harry, fidgeted beside their mother, clearly uncomfortable in their formal suits. James watched through his viewfinder as the family arranged themselves, noting how each member seemed to have their own relationship with the camera. Then Prince Philip walked in, and the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The Duke of Edinburgh had a commanding presence that James had heard about, but never experienced firsthand. At 66, Philip still carried himself with the military bearing that had defined his younger years in the Royal Navy. He wore his dress uniform, medals gleaming against the dark fabric, and his eyes immediately surveyed the scene with the sharp attention of someone accustomed to command. James had photographed difficult subjects before, but something about Prince Philip's demeanor made him nervous. The Duke's reputation for speaking his mind was well known, and James had heard stories from other photographers about Philip's impatience with lengthy photo sessions. As Philip took his position, standing behind the Queen's chair, James could feel those piercing eyes evaluating every aspect of the setup. The first few shots went smoothly. James called out gentle directions, asking for slight adjustments in posture or suggesting where family members should look. The Queen remained patient and professional, as did most of the family. But James noticed Prince Philip checking his watch and shifting his weight from foot to foot, subtle signs that his patience was wearing thin. James decided to take several safety shots before attempting the more creative angles he had planned. Through his lens, he could see the family's dynamics at play. The Queen's steady composure anchored the group, while Diana's natural grace made every pose look effortless. The young princes were clearly ready to be anywhere else, and Prince Charles seemed lost in his own thoughts. But it was Prince Philip who commanded attention, even when he wasn't trying to. After 20 minutes of shooting, James noticed Philip's expression growing more stern. The Duke had stopped making small talk with his family, and was staring directly at James with an intensity that made the photographer's palms sweat. James tried to work faster, but his nervousness was affecting his technique. He fumbled with his camera settings, dropped the lens cap, and had to ask his assistant to adjust a light that he could have fixed himself. The tension in the room was becoming palpable. James could sense that he was losing control of the session, something that rarely happened to him. He had photographed prime ministers and movie stars without breaking a sweat, but Prince Philip's unwavering gaze was undermining his confidence. The other family members seemed to sense the shift in mood as well, with Princess and glancing between her father and the photographer with obvious concern. James decided to try a different approach, asking the family to relax for a moment while he made some technical adjustments to his equipment. He hoped the brief break would allow everyone to reset, including himself. But as he bent over his camera bag, searching for a different lens, he could feel Prince Philip's eyes boring into him. The Duke's patience had clearly reached its limit, and James knew that whatever happened next would determine whether this photo session would be remembered as a triumph or a disaster. The silence that followed was deafening. James could hear the tick of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece as he continued searching through his camera bag with increasingly desperate movements. His assistant, Sarah, stood frozen by the lighting equipment, clearly sensing the tension but unsure how to help. The royal family remained in their positions, but James could feel their collective patience evaporating like morning mist. Prince Philip cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to echo through the vast room like thunder. James looked up from his bag to find the Duke staring at him with an expression that could have melted steel. Philip's military training was evident in his posture. Shoulders back, chin raised slightly, hands clasped behind his back in the stance of a naval officer addressing a subordinate who had failed to meet expectations. The Queen, ever the diplomat, attempted to diffuse the situation by making light conversation with Princess and about the upcoming garden party schedule. But her efforts felt forced, and everyone in the room knew that the real drama was unfolding between her husband and the photographer who seemed to be losing his nerve with each passing moment. James finally found the lens he was looking for, but his hand was shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it while attempting to attach it to his camera body. The clicking sound of the lens mount seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature maintained in the palace rooms to preserve the priceless artwork and furnishings. Diana, with her natural empathy, seemed to recognize James's distress. She gently adjusted young Prince William's collar and whispered something to Harry that made him smile, creating a momentary distraction from the mounting tension. But even her graceful intervention couldn't completely mask the fact that the photo session was rapidly deteriorating into an uncomfortable standoff between the photographer and the Duke of Edinburgh. Prince Philip's reputation for directness was legendary among palace staff and members of the press corps. Unlike other members of the royal family who had learned to suffer difficult situations with practiced patience, Philip had never been one to tolerate inefficiency or incompetence. His decades of public service had been marked by his ability to cut through pretense and get straight to the heart of any matter, a trait that served him well in his royal duties, but could be intimidating to those unprepared for his bluntness. James attempted to regain his composure by taking a deep breath and focusing on his technical setup. He checked his camera settings one more time, adjusted the position of his tripod, and signaled to Sarah to fine-tune the key light. These routine actions helped calm his nerves slightly, but he could still feel Prince Philip's unwavering scrutiny like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. The Duke's impatience wasn't entirely unreasonable. He had a full schedule of engagements that afternoon, including a visit to a naval college and a reception for visiting dignitaries. Time was always precious for members of the royal family, whose days were planned down to the minute by private secretaries and equerries. Every extra minute spent in this photo session was a minute taken away from other important duties and commitments. Prince Charles seemed to sense his father's growing irritation and attempted to engage him in conversation about a recent polo match. Philip responded with polite but clipped answers, his attention never fully leaving the photographer who was still fumbling with his equipment. The Duke's eyes held a mixture of impatience and assessment, as if he were evaluating not just James's technical skills, but his overall competence as a professional. Princess Anne, who had inherited much of her father's directness, glanced at her watch and then at James with an expression that clearly conveyed her own growing impatience. She had always been the most practical member of the royal family, with little tolerance for unnecessary delays or complications. Her schedule was equally packed with engagements, and she had little patience for a photographer who seemed unable to do his job efficiently. James finally managed to attach his new lens and raised his camera to his eye, hoping to restart the session with renewed confidence. But as he looked through the viewfinder, he realized that his earlier fumbling had somehow knocked his tripod slightly off-center, meaning that the carefully planned composition was now askew. He would need to make another adjustment, which would require asking the royal family to wait even longer while he corrected his mistake. The moment of truth had arrived. James could either acknowledge his error and make the necessary correction, risking further delay and potentially pushing Prince Philip's patience past the breaking point, or he could attempt to work with the imperfect setup and hope that he could salvage decent photographs despite the technical compromise. Either choice carried significant risk, and he could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a heavy burden. Prince Philip's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle sign that his military training and reading situations and people had led him to recognize that something was still not right with the photographer's setup. The Duke's experience in countless official events had given him an almost supernatural ability to sense when things were going smoothly and when they were about to go wrong. And right now, every instinct he had was telling him that this photo session was teetering on the edge of complete disaster. James made his decision and lowered his camera, knowing he had to fix the tripod position despite the risk of further annoying the already impatient Duke. As he reached for the tripod adjustment knob, his movement was hesitant and uncertain, betraying his nervousness to everyone in the room. The mechanical sound of the tripod legs adjusting seemed to echo endlessly in the ornate chamber. Prince Philip's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the photographer make yet another adjustment to equipment that should have been properly set up before the royal family arrived. The Duke had spent decades in situations where preparation and efficiency were matters of life and death during his naval service, and he had little tolerance for professionals who failed to meet basic standards of readiness. The Queen maintained her composure with the skill that had served her through decades of public engagements, but even she couldn't completely hide a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested her own patience was being tested. She had posed for thousands of photographs during her reign, and she could recognize when a photographer was struggling with basic technical competence. Her training had taught her to remain gracious under all circumstances, but it didn't mean she was oblivious to incompetence. Young Prince William, barely 5 years old, began to fidget more noticeably in his formal clothes. His child's instinct picked up on the adult's tension, and he started pulling at his collar and shifting from foot to foot. Princess Diana placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, trying to keep him calm while simultaneously monitoring the increasingly uncomfortable situation developing between her father-in-law and the photographer. Prince Harry, even younger than his brother, seemed less aware of the tension, but was clearly growing tired of standing still. He leaned against his mother's leg and looked longingly toward the door, as if hoping someone would announce that the photo session was over and he could return to his toys and games. James finally got his tripod positioned correctly and raised his camera again, but now his confidence was completely shattered. Through the viewfinder, he could see Prince Philip's stern expression and knew that any further delays would likely result in the Duke simply walking out of the session. The weight of potentially ruining an official royal portrait pressed down on James like a physical burden. His finger hovered over the shutter button, but something still didn't feel right. The lighting that had looked perfect during his setup now seemed harsh and unflattering on Prince Philip's face, creating shadows that made the Duke look more severe than James had intended. In his nervousness, he had forgotten to make a minor adjustment to the key light that would have softened the overall effect. Sarah, his assistant, seemed to sense James's continued hesitation and took a small step forward, ready to help if needed. But any movement toward the lighting equipment now would signal to the royal family that there were still technical problems to resolve. The delicate balance between getting the perfect shot and not testing the Duke's patience any further hung in the air like a sword ready to drop. Prince Philip's military background had taught him to recognize indecision when he saw it, and the photographer's hesitation was becoming increasingly obvious. The Duke had commanded ships and men in situations where quick, decisive action meant the difference between success and failure, and he had developed an almost allergic reaction to unnecessary delay and uncertainty. The Duke shifted his weight slightly and adjusted his uniform jacket with a movement that suggested he was preparing to end the session whether the photographer was ready or not. His body language spoke volumes about his state of mind, and everyone in the room could read the signs of his growing impatience. Princess checked her watch again, this time more obviously, and exchanged a meaningful glance with her brother Charles. Both of them had inherited aspects of their father's directness, and both were clearly reaching the limits of their tolerance for the photographer's continued struggles with basic professional competence. The ornate clock on the mantelpiece chimed the half hour, and the sound seemed to galvanize Prince Philip into action. He had given the photographer more than enough time to complete what should have been a straightforward task, and his natural inclination toward efficiency was overriding any remaining patience he might have had for James's technical difficulties. James could see through his viewfinder that Prince Philip was about to say something, and he knew instinctively that whatever the Duke was preparing to say would not be gentle or encouraging. The photographer's finger tightened on the shutter button as he realized that his next few seconds would determine whether he left the palace with successful photographs or with a story about how he had failed spectacularly in front of the entire royal family. The Duke of Edinburgh drew himself up to his full height, his navel bearing evident in every line of his posture. His eyes locked onto James's with the intensity of a commanding officer who had reached the end of his patience with his subordinate's incompetence. The moment that would become legendary in royal photography circles was about to unfold, and everyone in the room could sense that something significant was about to happen. Prince Philip's mouth opened slightly as he prepared to speak, and James knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next would change the entire dynamic of the photo session and possibly his career as a royal photographer. The tension in the room reached its breaking point as the Duke prepared to deliver the words that would become part of royal family folklore. The words came like a thunderclap in the elegant silence of the blue drawing room. "Just take the picture," Prince Philip said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The phrase was delivered not as a suggestion or a request, but as a direct command from a man whose patience had been completely exhausted by the photographer's endless delays and technical fumbling. The Duke's tone was crisp and final, each word pronounced with the precision of his naval training. There was no anger in his voice, but rather the cold efficiency of someone who had identified a problem and was implementing an immediate solution. His eyes remained fixed on James with an intensity that made it clear this was not the beginning of a negotiation, but the end of his tolerance for further delay. James felt his blood freeze in his veins as the full impact of the Duke's words hit him. In that moment, he realized that all his careful planning, his elaborate lighting setup, and his concerns about perfect technical execution had become completely irrelevant. Prince Philip had cut through all the complexity and reduced the situation to its most basic elements. There was a camera, there was a royal family, and there needed to be a photograph. Everything else was just unnecessary complication. The silence that followed the Duke's declaration was profound. Even the young princes seemed to understand that something significant had happened, though they couldn't fully grasp the implications. Princess Diana's eyes widened slightly, and she instinctively drew her sons closer to her, as if protecting them from the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Queen Elizabeth II maintained her composed expression, but those who knew her well might have detected the slightest hint of amusement in her eyes. She had been married to Philip for 40 years, and was thoroughly familiar with his direct approach to problem-solving. His words, while blunt, were characteristic of the man who had never hesitated to speak his mind when he felt action was needed. James's training as a professional photographer suddenly kicked in, overriding his nervousness and uncertainty. The Duke's command had paradoxically freed him from the paralysis of trying to achieve perfection. With trembling hands but renewed purpose, he raised his camera and began shooting, his finger working the shutter button with mechanical precision. The first few frames captured the family in a moment of genuine reaction to Philip's outburst. There was surprise, amusement, and a hint of tension in their expressions that made for surprisingly authentic portraits. The Queen's slight smile, Princess Anne's barely suppressed grin, and Prince Charles's look of resignation at his father's characteristic directness all combined to create images that were far more natural and revealing than any carefully posed shot could have been. Prince Philip himself seemed to relax once he had taken control of the situation. His posture remained military straight, but the tight set of his jaw eased slightly, and he even allowed himself a small smile as he watched the photographer finally doing his job with appropriate efficiency. The Duke's intervention had worked exactly as intended, cutting through the unnecessary complexity and getting results. James found himself working with a fluidity and confidence that had been completely absent from the earlier part of the session. The Duke's blunt command had somehow liberated him from his own perfectionism and reminded him of the fundamental truth of photography. The best camera settings in the world meant nothing without the decisive moment of actually pressing the shutter button. The lighting that James had worried wasn't quite perfect turned out to capture the family beautifully, with natural shadows that gave depth and character to their faces. Prince Philip's concern about harsh lighting proved unfounded, as the existing setup created dramatic, but flattering portraits that would later be praised by photography critics and royal watchers alike. As James continued shooting, he began to understand why Prince Philip's direct approach had been so effective. The Duke had recognized what James had failed to see in his nervousness, that the technical aspects of photography, while important, were secondary to the human element of capturing authentic moments and genuine expressions. The atmosphere in the room transformed completely as the photo session found its rhythm. The royal family, freed from the tension of watching a struggling photographer, began to interact more naturally with each other and with James. Even the young princes settled into the session, responding to the newfound energy and efficiency that characterized the proceedings. Princess Diana's natural grace became more evident as she relaxed, and her interactions with her sons created some of the most touching moments of the entire session. Prince Charles emerged from his earlier distraction and began engaging with his family in ways that created authentic opportunities for meaningful photographs. James realized that Prince Philip's intervention had taught him a valuable lesson about the nature of his craft. All the technical knowledge and expensive equipment in the world couldn't replace the fundamental requirement to be decisive and confident in capturing moments as they unfolded. The Duke's military background had given him an understanding of this truth that James, in his nervousness, had temporarily forgotten. The session that had begun as a potential disaster was transforming into one of the most successful royal portrait sessions James had ever conducted. The combination of technical competence and authentic human interaction was creating images that would become treasured additions to the royal family's official photograph collection. 20 minutes later, James lowered his camera with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt at the beginning of the session. The transformation had been remarkable. What started as a technical nightmare had evolved into one of the most productive royal photography sessions of his career. The images he had captured told a story not just of a royal family, but of authentic human relationships and genuine moments of connection. Prince Philip, having achieved his desired result through direct intervention, seemed genuinely pleased with how the session had concluded. His earlier sternness had given way to something approaching satisfaction as he watched James work with newfound confidence and efficiency. The Duke's military experience had taught him that sometimes the best way to help someone succeed was to force them past their own hesitations and self-doubt. As the royal family began to disperse, each returning to their packed schedules of official duties, Queen Elizabeth II paused to speak with James. Her words were gracious and encouraging, praising the photographer's professionalism and expressing her satisfaction with the session. But James could detect a subtle acknowledgement in her tone that recognized how the session had been rescued from potential disaster by her husband's characteristic intervention. Princess Diana approached James with her characteristic warmth, thanking him for his patience with the young princes and complimenting him on his ability to capture their natural personalities despite the formal setting. Her genuine appreciation meant a great deal to James, who had been terrified that his early struggles might have created lasting negative impressions with the family. Prince Philip himself stopped to speak with James before leaving the blue drawing room. The Duke's words were brief but meaningful, acknowledging the photographer's eventual success while offering a subtle lesson about the importance of decisiveness in professional situations. His tone was no longer stern, but rather that of an experienced commander offering guidance to someone who had learned from a difficult experience. As James and his assistant Sarah packed up their equipment, they worked in companionable silence, both processing what had just occurred. The elaborate lighting setup that had seemed so crucial earlier in the day was dismantled with quick efficiency, and James found himself reflecting on how his priorities had shifted during the course of the session. Sarah, who had witnessed the entire transformation, finally spoke as they loaded the last of the camera cases. She observed that James had captured some of his most compelling royal portraits once he stopped overthinking the technical aspects and focused on the human elements of the situation. Her insight helped James understand that Prince Philip's intervention had been more than just an expression of impatience. It had been a masterclass in cutting through complexity to reach essential truths. Over the following weeks, as James developed and printed the photographs from the session, he was amazed by the quality and authenticity of the images he had captured after Prince Philip's intervention. The shots taken during his period of technical uncertainty were stiff and formal, lacking the life and personality that characterized the later photographs. The difference was so dramatic that it seemed like the work of two different photographers. The story of Prince Philip's blunt command quickly spread through London's photography community, becoming a legendary tale about the importance of confidence and decisiveness in professional situations. Other photographers who heard the story recognized the universal truth it contained, that sometimes the pursuit of technical perfection could become an obstacle to achieving genuine artistic success. Years later, James would cite that afternoon in the blue drawing room as a turning point in his career. Prince Philip's three-word command had taught him more about photography than years of technical training and expensive workshops. The lesson was simple but profound. All the preparation and equipment in the world meant nothing without the courage to act decisively when the moment demanded it. The photographs from that session became some of the most celebrated royal portraits of the 1980s, appearing in newspapers and magazines around the world. Critics praised their authenticity and emotional depth, qualities that had emerged directly from the moment when technical perfection gave way to genuine human interaction facilitated by Prince Philip's characteristic directness. James kept one particular photograph from that session on his office wall for the rest of his career, an image captured just moments after the Duke's intervention, showing Prince Philip with a hint of a satisfied smile as he watched the photographer finally doing his job with appropriate confidence. It served as a daily reminder of the lesson he had learned about the relationship between technical competence and professional courage. The blue drawing room returned to its usual quiet elegance after the photography equipment was removed, but the echoes of that afternoon's drama lingered in the memories of everyone who had witnessed Prince Philip's masterful intervention. The Duke had demonstrated once again why his direct approach to problem-solving had served him well throughout decades of public service. For James, the experience became a defining moment that shaped his approach to every subsequent assignment. He learned to trust his instincts, to act decisively even in challenging circumstances, and to remember that the most important element in any photograph was not technical perfection, but the authentic capture of genuine human moments. The legend of Prince Philip's "just take the picture" command lived on in photography circles for decades, passed down from mentor to student as an example of how sometimes the best advice is also the simplest. The Duke's words had cut through complexity and uncertainty to reveal an essential truth about the nature of professional excellence, that knowledge and preparation must ultimately give way to confident action when the moment for decision arrives.